kick off, have a Tuesday tidbit here of, is your browser history or calculator history more embarrassing? Realization for myself on how many simple calculations I do on a calculator that are needless. So today, Dave Ratcliff, who's one of our senior consulting engineers, is going to give a presentation on the various parameters to tune for fracture geometries. But before that, we'll give a brief intro to ResFrac, although I think most are familiar with it. And another shout out for Joe, who's on the chairing committee for this analytics workshop. So that will be in the slides if you download the slides afterwards. For ResFrac, our goal is to maximize economic returns and provide a tool to allow operators to do so. And the key to doing that with ResFrac software is that we have the capability of simulating the entire life cycle of a well in a single model. So that means fracture propagation all the way through production and a subsequent production or stimulation activities like child wells or EOR or refracs, and broadly applicable to many asset types, although today we're going to focus on unconventionals, as that is kind of the bulk of our applications. So moving forward, we can separate that into three major components. So on the left-hand side, I'm showing fracture propagation. In the middle, reservoir flow from the matrix into the fractures. And then on the right-hand side, geomechanics. So we're looking at the stress change in the matrix there due to pressure depletion. And if we go forward a slide, we will get to see all of these effects together in this parent-child video. So here, the left-hand well is my parent well. With fracking, we see prop and distribution there in the upper right. And then as we go into production, we're going to see the pressure drawn down in the fractures as well as the matrix. And after 3 years, we'll shut in the parent well, start fracking the child well, and we're going to see asymmetric fracture propagation, which is a consequence of that poor elastic stress depletion. And as a result, we do not generate any new fracture area to the right-hand side of that child well. And consequently, the child well then underperforms the parent by about a factor of 2. That is the key to integrating all these processes. ResFrac, as a company, offers both licensing as well as consulting services. Today is meant to be technical, though, so if we request that you keep those questions to be technical in nature, and if you want to have a commercial discussion, we're happy to take that offline. And finally, a map of our experience here. We have now 30 plus clients across the Americas, spanning from the Montney through North America down to the Vaca Muerta. And so as Dave walks through his experience on ResFrac tuning parameters, he will personally draw upon lots of experience across those basins. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Dave to get going on today's topic.
Hey, thanks, Garrett. Appreciate that. Today, we're going to look at the different types of diagnostics within ResFrac to tune the fracture geometry to what we see with fiber optics, pressure interference testing, and that sort of stuff. So here we are. What are some of the different high-end inputs, some of them, into the fracture geometry tuning? The first, and one we've started to see a lot, is the fiber optics and or offset pressure responses, potentially. It's done wonders to be able to put together actual frac lengths and understanding the amount of frac hits, all kinds of stuff. So it's, in my mind, one of the best things that's happened in fracture geometry tuning since I've started with ResFrac. Then the production pressure interference testing, we'll go over that, how we different ideas for matching within ResFrac. We'll look at treating pressures and ISIPs and some different ideas for matching that. And then also, the production gives clues to our geometry as well, especially with regards to propped fracture geometry. So really quickly, we're going to go through a couple of very wordy slides. In the history matching process, we have the general order. It does not mean it's going to go exactly like this, because one of the things I'd like to reiterate throughout this whole presentation is that everything you do on one side to match a fracture half length is going to affect something else. So it all has to work together and iteratively. But the general idea is that make a good list, have an objective when you're doing the history match. Set up your model with the geologic properties, wellbore and completion designs, fracturing and production schedules. This is all the dirty work. It's not any fun to do, but it pays dividends if you do it correctly at the beginning. Run the initial models using the bottom hole pressure control. Use microseismic, frac hit data, DOS, and other data to roughly tune the fracture geometries. If available, use step-down test, camera, dark vision to understand our perfect efficiency. And at that point, you can start adding external fractures and tune to match stretch shadowing observed in stress observation planes. Check that ISIPs and net pressures match field observations within reason. And we'll actually go through this in a good way to do it and what to look for. Adjust the wellbore friction factors to match surface treating pressures and ISIPs. Tune relative permeabilities, endpoints, and exponents to match water cuts. Plot rail perm curves, and we cannot emphasize this enough, draw them out. And what's even better is that Mark has in the UI now, you click on one of those little graph things in the UI, and you can just see how your rail perm curve looks. So it's all there for you. Use RTA to hone in on permeability and fracture conductivity in early time. You have to use your rail perms to match GOR behavior along with your fluid, types of fluid that you have. So make sure your fluid is in there correctly. And then use the RTA characteristics to identify later time phenomena, such as interference, no flow boundary, dropping below bubble point. Call it inverse PDP when instead of an increase in your apparent permeability, you actually start seeing decreases in permeability due to stress changes in the matrix. This is the last of the big slides, but these are all the big tuning parameters that we have available to us in ResFrac, and they're all kind of used in conjunction with each other. I can't stress that enough. Every time you make a change to one, you're probably going to have to go back and iterate on what you have done before a little bit. Once you start to get the hang of it, it's not near as hard as what it may sound when I'm talking about it, but there is a certain amount of iterations that you're going to have to do. So the first one, and one of the biggest ones, is toughness. Fracture toughness for proper fracture propagation, both in the vertical and the horizontal directions. Within ResFrac, the stress intensity is calculated at the edge of every fracture element. And if that stress intensity exceeds toughness, then the fracture goes on and makes a new element. The relative fracture toughness works in conjunction with the toughness. What it does as a function of length of the either the short or the long part of the fracture, you specify which, it actually will increase the toughness needed to propagate. So a higher number of relative fracture toughness will generally result in a smaller fracture area. Permeability multiplier, that goes without saying. Permeabilities from core are generally not quite right. So you may have to adjust those permeabilities. Keep in mind, once you adjust a permeability up or down, you may have to change your toughness up or down to continue matching your geometries. Pressure dependent permeability. Basically what this does is makes permeability as a function of pressure. It's most often used to capture the effects of accelerated leak off from secondary fractures so that the fracture is allowed to close in a reasonable amount of time. So sometimes if you don't have enough fracture to close that fracture, and you don't have any pressure dependent permeability, it might take days, weeks, months, at least within the simulation, to close a fracture. And obviously that's probably not right. So you will need to adjust it based on the pressure in the fracture as the pressure increases. One thing to note, that as you increase the permeability as a function of pressure, you are effectively going to shorten your fracture half lengths and heights because you are increasing leak off. Proppant immobilization, this is a big one. You'll hear me use it over and over. Basically, this is the amount of proppant left behind due to ledges, kinks, roughness, etc. The more immobilized proppant you have, the smaller the propped area is going to be, because it's literally holding that proppant back because of these ledges, kinks, etc. Okay, that's a huge tuning factor that I'll show you how to use in a bit. Proppant embedment, of course, this is how far the proppant is embedded in the formation. This can affect fracture conductivity. We have a pretty good, default in ResFrac, but you may need to adjust it as well. A new concept that we've been introducing is fracture strands per cluster. So this parameter is intended to capture the effect of multiple fracture strands propagating within a single fracture swarm. You can set all the parameters that change this independently of one another as well. So this is going to vary toughness, PDP, and fracture conductivity as a function of the amount of swarms that are specified. But you can do that all separately if you want to take down that approach as well. And literally, you just say, I have 2 swarms per cluster, and it will take care of it for you. And then might be a much easier way to match frac geometry. Fracture collision distance. Okay, so this is the distance between fractures from other wells before they begin to coalesce. I mean, somewhere out in the middle of nowhere, if you think that your fractures are hitting each other and becoming one big gigantic fracture between 2 different wells, then you may want to set this value to be fairly significant. However, if you don't, then you would set it to be fairly small. It's always a function of the distance between the fractures as they propagate by each other. Cased well and fracture connection distance. So this distance requires that a frac hit actually happen and be near enough to an offset perforation from a well to become hydraulically connected. And don't worry about what that means right now. I'm going to show a picture of it. It makes it much more clear. Viscosity can be used to tune, but usually your viscosities are pretty well known, so we won't go into that too much. A big one that within ResFrac, we just kind of leave this in there. We always leave a certain amount of heterogeneity in there. We don't believe necessarily that all fractures are pretty butterflies, so we leave this in here. But basically, what this does is it creates heterogeneity in every fracture toughness cell by varying the toughness by this percentage. So a 0.1 heterogeneity factor equates to a 10% increase or decrease in toughness. After the fractures stop propagating, that difference becomes fairly small and the stress shadowing, et cetera, takes over. And then finally, proppant conductivity. And it's basically a scalar applied to the proppant conductivity equation within ResFrac. And you can use that to tune for signs of fracture damage, GOR trends, stuff like that. It becomes pretty important, especially in gas. So enough of that. That was tough to get through, but these, you can use these as a reference to what you want to try to get done in your own simulation. Let's start looking at fiber optics. So in this scenario, I just have a well, and I actually have 2 fiber wells, but really, it would probably be better to have 1 fiber well and then frac all these other wells around it. And from that, you can start understanding, well, how fast was that first arrival? What was the propagation rate? If you have multiple wells or multiple fibers, you can start to understand what the travel distance was. So if you got a well 2,000 feet away and you don't see any hit from it, well, you've at least defined a boundary. You've got a well that's 400 feet away and you see 10 out of 10 hits. If you had 10 clusters, then you've defined a boundary. Once again, that goes right into how many arrivals. So if you had a well, frac fiber well 2,000 feet away, and you get 1 hit, well, that's significant if you've only got 1 hit in other places as well. So understanding how many arrivals you have, how far they're traveling, how fast they're traveling. And then finally, if you can see on your fiber plots, your waterfall plots, a closer signature, that goes a long way to understanding how fast these are closing. And all of those are going to go to defining, one, the toughness. So lower toughness is going to allow these fractures to travel longer and faster. Relative fracture toughness, lower numbers, does the exact same thing. Pressure dependent permeability is going to allow your fractures to close faster. They're also going to, it's also going to propagate your fractures faster. Heterogeneity, I'm going to go over here in just a second, but basically the more you may need to introduce a certain amount of heterogeneity to match how many hits that you're getting on your fiber, how many arrivals. Fracture coalescence, once again, if you paid attention to how many hits you are, this might lead into some insight into how much fracture coalescence you're having out there. For instance, if you have 10 a parent-child type situation and you only see 2 or 3 fracture initiations, you might assume that you had a lot of fracture coalescence out in the wellbore. If you see 10 out of 10, then you assume you might don't have any. And then it kind of gives you a minimum horizontal stress confirmation as well, especially if you have wells in different zones with different stress contrasts. If you have a fiber well that's 500 feet below and you saw a ton of hits on it, but in your model you didn't see any, that might be somewhere where you need to start looking at your horizontal stress calibrations. So this is what I was talking about with regards to heterogeneity. So I've got two situations here. One, symmetric fractures, and this is very crudely drawn, and I apologize. But the overall length of these symmetric fractures can be as long as what you see here with asymmetric fractures. That doesn't mean they're not propagating the same speed, but they're not reaching the same overall distance. So if you would put a well right here, where my mouse is going up and down, and I hope you can see that, you might surmise that you have asymmetric fractures because you're getting the exact same number of frac hits. If you move that well over 1,000 feet, then you might surmise, well, you know what, maybe I only have 1 or 2 or 3 fracs out of this 6 cluster well hitting. And you might start to surmise that you have asymmetric fractures, especially if you put a well over on the other side. Okay, that's basically the ideas behind symmetric and asymmetric fractures. I'd like to show you what closure looks like within ResFrac so that you can start to quantify what closure looks like. So what I'm showing here is a parameter in our 3D graphics called E-open. A lot of you already know what this is, but for those that don't, this is the portion of the fracture that is not touching the fracture walls or the proppant. So basically, it's an open part of the fracture. Well, once you're done fracking, like we see here on the left, we have a very large, and I've blown up the scales to show the contrast here, but nothing's touching anything right now. We have these very, very large apertures and nothing's happening. But after using PDP, and PDP works with permeability, you can start to adjust the time it takes for these fractures to close. And once the fracture closes after X amount of hours, then you get this signature here where you have basically everything's touching everything and almost 100% closure. There's something to look for when you're tuning with regards to trying to match closure rates if you're seeing those in the waterfall plots in your fiber data. Okay, so let's go on to production pressure interference testing. So the goal of measuring a pressure response while fracking is to understand half lengths and heights to mitigate potential frac hit damage. Well, really the goal of production pressure interference testing is to understand the true scope of how these wells remain in contact and how that relates to the amount of area that you're actually producing. What I'm showing here in this big red circle there is we have a frac hit. This well was fracked first, this well was fracked second. We have hit this other well. We noted that frac hit on the fiber data or pressure response data from whatever we decided to measure. We do a production interference testing. Well, that frac hit is no longer being manifested itself in the production pressure interference testing. And we have to ask ourselves, well, when I did the production interference test, I do have a connection here. But normally, the non-prop frac conductivity in ResFrac is potentially pretty low, and we won't see this response unless we have proppant that has crossed that wellbore. Well, this well and this well are 800 feet apart. Do we really think we're going to get proppant all the way over there? Maybe, but more than likely not. So what are some different scenarios that we can understand in order to get that interference testing to look like what we saw in the field? Well, the first thing we can do is we can bridge proppant through the cased well hydraulic connection. So in this scenario, fracture from well 1 hits well number 2 and becomes hydraulically connected. to well number 1. However, the proppant never actually reached well number 2. You actually see a fracture where that happened. This is well number 1 here. That proppant didn't get all the way over there, so we don't have a connection except for we frac hit the well. Well number 2 begins to frac and actually places proppant in well number 1's fracture. So when well number 2 fracs, it's actually creating its own proppant cloud within the fracture created by well number 1. Eventually, this allows the proppant to bridge across and create a conductive pathway for the necessary pressure interference that we saw in the real world data. This allows us to tune how big this proppant cloud needs to be in order to get the fracture, to get the conductivity that we need. If we decrease the proppant immobilization, this will increase the propped area. It'll also lower the fracture conductivity. It'll also potentially lower the GOR response. It can have a lot of different effects, but we still need this connection in order to match what we saw. So the things that we would match in ResFrac to make this work is 1, proppant immobilization. We have to create the size of this cloud. Cased well and fracture connection distance. So that's the distance that this fracture from well 1 to well 2 has to be. You see a little perforation there. So that has to be within whatever the distance you set of that perforation, 3, 5, 7, 10 feet of that perforation before a hydraulic connection is created. You can also create a little extra additional wellbore pressure. So even if they are hydraulically connected, it may take an extra 200, 300, 400 PSI to go through the wellbore and into this fracture. And then another one that was introduced recently to kind of help with this and maybe the randomness of it, but you can actually set a fracture initiation randomness parameter. So it'll take your actual cluster, the actual spot where your cluster was said to initiate, and you can vary that by plus or minus 3 feet, 2 feet, 1 feet, and it'll set a random number in between those two boundaries. So you can actually randomize your perforation clusters so that, not every single fracture has been connected, but only a couple or, 1 here and there. Another way to get this interference is actual fracture coalescence out in the wellbore. So if your fiber's not showing a huge amount of clusters that are traveling through the fiber, you might surmise that, I don't have that happening. I have fractures coalescing out in the middle of the wellbore. I'm not seeing the amount of hits that I thought I would see. And just the proppant bridging from these coalescence happens and creating this bridging. History matching parameters here. Once again, proppant immobilization. You have to get your proppant out far enough to create a conductivity between the fractures. And then the fracture collision relative distance, which is a function right now of your fracture element length. So you would specify, if you specified 0.1 and your fracture element length was 100, then if the fractures got within 10 feet of each other out here in the matrix, then they would coalesce. And then finally, the easiest thing to do is just raise your unpropped fracture conductivity. So anywhere where you see this blue is, very small conductivity. But we could actually, if we need to, raise that unpropped conductivity to match real world observations. And you would do that by changing a parameter called E naught max, and that's located in the static model for every single layer you specify. So let's look at ISIPs. This is coming from, I just borrowed his equation from Nicholas Russell over at ConocoPhillips. But basically, ISIP is a function of your net pressure plus your SH min, plus the stress shadowing caused by the previous stage, plus in ResFrac, the near wellbore tortuosity, and also wellbore friction. Your primary options to affect ISIP within ResFrac are toughness and or relative fracture toughness. If you lower it, you're going to lower your ISIPs. In ResFrac, we calculate the stress shadowing, and we can actually introduce stress shadowing from external fractures. Well, if your ISIP is too high and you've got a stress shadowing in there already, and you need to lower your ISIP, I would probably start by lowering the stress shadowing. Minimum horizontal stress too. I can't stress this enough. We would like to think all of our data is exactly right, but especially when you're having to calibrate maybe to one DFID over an entire zone, there can be some differences in the minimum horizontal stress that will cause the stress shadowing to be too large or too small. And then to a certain extent, after we will look at wellbore friction. If you have that data, that's awesome. But normally it's used kind of as a slight tuning factor. And then near wellbore tortuosity. I say decrease. I don't know why I said decrease there. It's just, that's something you can increase or decrease depending on what you have. So here is our stress shadowing plane in ResFrac. The simulations are, they're fairly lengthy, so we're not able to simulate the entire wellbore yet. And we need to be able to place the first stage in a stress environment that is consistent with the previous stages. So the amount and width of the stress shadowing is going to be controlled by the aperture of the fracture at the time when the next stage begins. So basically, if I had just finished pumping here, I'd let these fractures close a bit until the next stage was ready to start. I would note the pressure here in the fracture aperture. I would note the width, because the highest amount of stress shadowing is going to be dictated by where there's proppant. Everywhere else it closes, it kind of closes back down to normal. And then, you can control things to the aperture itself it can be controlled by the fluid viscosity, the amount of proppant mobilization, and also the fracture length. The longer the fracture length, the smaller your apertures, which would mean smaller stress shadowing. But the fact of the matter is, we want to put in an external fracture outside of the simulation that will simulate this stress shadowing as best as possible. All right, this is the reason why. All right, so if we don't have any external fractures, then what we note is, and I've built into my production injection sequence a 15-minute of no proppant, no water scenario, where we're still measuring the actual pressure on the wellhead. This would be the same pressure that would be measured on surface to get this ISIP. Well, if you don't have stress shadowing, you'll note that stress shadowing does increase in real world data and in ResFrac simulations, maybe not at quite the same rate, but it does increase. We want to basically, we don't want to simulate this. We want to simulate somewhere in the well, 3 stages in the well that are most descriptive of what's actually happening, so that when we upscale, we can effectively upscale our production to the entire wellbore production. Let's just go on to the next slide versus looking at all that. Here's what we would like to see once these fractures have been added. You'll note these little gray ellipses are fractures that I have added in this simulation to mimic that stress shadowing. Things to look for. 1, your ISIPs are now mostly consistent. Are they going to be perfect? No, but we're not seeing an escalation either. 2, we want to make sure that our fracture geometry is not changing significantly after 3 stages. If we get this stage to look like this, but this stage looks totally different, then we can probably surmise that our first fracture, our external fracture was not right. Plus, we would see some problems with our ISIPs. All right, so they should be similar. They're not going to be exact, but they should be similar. What are the effects of a wellbore friction and wellbore tortuosity? So I just ran a couple of generic simulations here. If you increase wellbore friction, you're going to decrease your wellhead pressure you see in ResFrac, and you will also decrease the ISIP. So increase wellhead pressure and decrease ISIP. Same goes with wellbore tortuosity. Increasing friction coefficient will increase wellhead pressure and decrease the ISIP. And I apologize, the ISIP is right here, and it's difficult to see, but it is actually decreasing relative to the other one. And this is just with 2 different tortuosity coefficients in there. Okay, so now that we've gone through how we use the fiber production interference testings, how we use ISIP data and wellhead pressure data, finally, we're going to look at just a couple of clues that just production can give us with respect to especially propped geometry. So the first thing you want to look at here is your initial GOR. If your simulation is starting above the bubble point, then the simulation GOR should equal the actual GOR at the start of production. If it doesn't, we've got a problem with our fluid and or bubble point pressures. Okay, make sure that if you're above bubble point, make sure that your initial GOR is correct. The magnitude and the timing of the increase in GOR is tied to the drawdown schedule, of course. However, the producible or the propped area is what's going to be driving the GOR changes. And the fracture, so the producible area of the fracture determines how hard the fracture will actually draw the matrix down. Okay, so if you have a very small area, you're going to draw that part of the matrix down very quickly and quickly make this bend in the GOR much too fast. So that gives you one of your clues that, well, if I'm drawing it down too hard, maybe I need to increase my propped area. And you can do that by, for instance, reducing your proppant and mobilization. Or if you think you're exactly right with your proppant and mobilization, you could actually increase your proppant conductivity. By extension, if you're not seeing this GOR increase, then you're drawing down too large of an area and you may need to increase your proppant mobilization. All right, using the RTA, which we'll show next, and help kind of determine the timing of these signatures with regard to propped conductivity. So here I've got basically the purple is the simulated data. The orange is actual data for a kind of a generic well. Here we see that the simulated fracture conductivity is high in my simulated well, which is resulting in a lower y-intercept. Here, the fracture conductivity is a little low. I have decreased my proppant conductivity to look at this y-intercept. And finally, I got the fracture conductivity just right. I feel like Goldilocks and the three bears here a little bit, but along with the, the bend associated with the increasing GOR signature. So as the GOR goes up, we start seeing this increased bend. We would like to do our initial calculations early time, like we had mentioned on the slide number 2. So do your permeabilities, etc., and fracture conductivities early, because once you start dropping below the GOR, you're going to start seeing the bends, which we could start seeing ourselves manifest itself here with this increasing GOR. Not to say you can't use your rail perms to help out getting those necessary matches, but really the first place to start would be with your fracture conductivity, your proppant conductivity. That is K naught under your proppants, and start with that first. It can also help reduce, you may have seen this, you've run a lot of simulations, you get a very large influx of water and oil. If your fracture conductivity is huge or infinite, then, well, that's why, is because you're allowing it to draw down as much as you want right there at the beginning. So try decreasing your fracture conductivity a little bit. So once again, I just want to end this with the idea that all of this is dependent on each other. It's really an iterative process, and that we have kind of a methodology for matching within ResFrac, like I showed on slide 2. But really, you're going to have to keep coming back. You're going to have to keep going back and up and down this chain. And just to give you an example, for a typical workflow that I might see is, I get a fiber optic response. From that, I'm going to have to match toughness, RFT, and PDP to try to ballpark those fracture growth rates, closures, lengths, using all that fiber data. ISIP values will be wrong, so I'll have to do something to actually fix those ISIP values. I'll look at toughness, RFT, SH-man, wellbore friction, or near wellbore tortuosity. Once I fix those, I got to go back, make sure my fracture growth rates, etc., are the same, or at least close. And then maybe I can start looking at the actual production. Well, the production required a permeability change because the permeability is provided wasn't right. So I increased my permeability by 5x. Well, that's going to shorten my fracture geometry. So now I got to go back, adjust my toughness, my RFT, my PDP to make sure that the permeability change, which also increased my closure rate, is all back in the same ballpark. The GOR, obviously I didn't get my GOR right on the very first time. I didn't see any bend, so my immobilization rate wasn't right. So now I got to fix my immobilization rate, and then I didn't match the Y-intercept as well. So I got to fix that. Well, the immobilization rate's going to affect the GOR. Now I got to make sure that that matches the actual production. And if I have offset wells, I have to make sure that any pressure interference testing is also satisfied as well. So you can see it's an ongoing process. As you get through it, you can definitely get faster at doing it, but it takes time. But the idea is to understand how all these parameters work together and how changing each one is going to affect either something down the line or even worse, something that you did previously. And if you forget to check that you have changed something significantly, you could be history matching the wrong thing. So with that said, oh, and I would also like to say, feel free, shoot us an email. There's a ResFrac hotline. You can ask questions. I talk to a lot of people a lot of times. So in fact, I enjoy it now that I'm sitting at home because I don't get much much socialization. So feel free to ask me questions. I do like to answer them if I can. With that, here's the general inquiries. Please use it. Please ask questions. Thanks. And anybody have any questions?
Thanks, Dave. You should note that I gave you some Zoom applause. Cherished acknowledgement.
Well, I guess I'm super great at explaining everything, or I put everybody to sleep. I haven't decided which. While within ResFrac, we can simulate the actual fiber response based on the deformation of the fiber. We don't actually input that into the simulation. We use the simulation to match the observations that you perceived on the fiber. That makes sense? Did I answer that? Okay. Eric?
Yeah. Yeah, we can't. We've actually talked about it. I'm not sure where it is on the development roadmap of putting in the XYZ coordinates of microseismic events to co-visualize with the fractures, but currently we don't support that capacity. Probably in the next couple months we will.
This question comes from Brian Gilmore. Have you ever had issues with too much water production at the well pop, even with reasonable PDP values? Yeah, we have. As a matter of fact, I'm starting to believe that fracture conductivity could have a place in that. But, the closer I'm getting to the matched frac areas of the fiber with the PDP values to match the closure rates that we're seeing, and then making sure that I have reasonable values for fracture conductivity, I've been able to mitigate those responses greatly. So it's coming together for sure that, like I said, it all works together. And that brings me to another point, kind of one of those red flag things. Anytime you start having to use numbers that seem unrealistically high or anything, or unrealistically low to match your production responses, that should throw up a red flag. Either ask a question or understand what's happening with the UI. One of those that can be a really easy false path to go down is increasing your PDP to reduce that initial production. So if you have that initial production, your PDP is good, your closure is good, probably something else is affecting that production to a certain extent. I always think you're going to see a little bit of that because usually the pressures that they pop the wells at are a little bit below the ResFrac pressures within the fractures. And so you get that instantaneous drawdown, whether it's 200-300 PSI, which always kind of gives you that little bit of extra production, but it should be relatively small. That help, Brian? He says, thanks. Thank you.
Okay. Well, I don't see any questions coming in here. So I think we'll probably wrap up for the afternoon. As always, toward the end of the week or on Monday next week, the video and the slides will be sent out and you can download those at your leisure. Until then, we look forward to seeing you all in 2 weeks. I think September 7th or 8th is the next office hours session. So thank you all, and thanks again to Dave.
All right, if you're in Houston, stay safe. Or New Orleans.
That's right. Head for high ground.